Classes in session. Hey everybody, and welcome to Unlearn 16 Classes in Session. And today, guys, class actually is going to be in session because I'm going to talk about education. I have to. I've spent a lot of time listening to different ministers of education or governors of Florida or political pundits of every stripe talk about how we need to get back to basics in education. And I need you to understand what that's code for and how ridiculous they sound. Okay? The notion that we have to go back to some sort of pre existing educational model is actually counterintuitive to education. Don't think about it for a second. That's like saying, you know what? I really liked healthcare and the way that we did medicine in the 1950s. Forget everything we've learned after that. Let's go back to that. It doesn't even make sense. It also doesn't even make sense to go back to the way that we distributed and executed healthcare back in the day. Why? Because there's a whole bunch of new technology, there's a whole bunch of new diseases, there's a whole bunch of new treatments. So why on earth do we ever think that we can go back to something else and back to basics? Who? Two things. There's an assumption that kids aren't learning the basics, which is asinine. There's also this ridiculous assumption that the way we did it is somehow inherently better. The way that school was better. I'm 48 years old, so I'm going to talk about my generation because I feel as though most people who are talking like this are from my generation, maybe a little bit older, but for the most part, let's say they're between their 40s and 50s, going off about how education used to be. And listen, I did well in my educational career. So do I feel comfortable with the way it used to be? Sure. But do I think kids today are smarter? Yeah. Yeah, I do. Do I think education today takes more innovation, takes more intelligence, takes more creativity, must take a more holistic viewpoint where we have to completely and utterly redesign education in order to meet current issues and trends and realities of today? Absolutely. You want to know why they don't want to do it? Money. Want to know why they want to go back to basics? Money. They want to pretend as though we had it right, 40 years ago? And 40 years ago, when we could jam 30 kids in a classroom and ignore all different learning abilities, let those kids just leave school altogether and just funnel through with whatever the standard stereotypical student looked like. And then that's it. Is that what we're doing here? Because every time I check for people who have genius ideas, who transform the world, who reshape the globe, who are doing all these amazing things, you want to know what their commonality is? They left the educational system. Why? They didn't do well. Why? Because that system is built for standard. It is not built to sort of mutate or change or accelerate or take in new information because it's so slowly moving. And in somewhere like Ontario, and this is different than parts of the United States, but somewhere like Ontario, it takes a big chunk of provincial money to do so. And that's the argument right there. And I'm going to talk about Stephen Lecce because he won't shut up about back to basics. And I'm going to use Ron DeSantis because he does the same thing. But let me be very clear. They are doing it to save money. It is about a bottom line. It is not about better educating our kids. It is not about making them aware and empowered and capable of future. I don't know. Look, why they're doing that? Well, I assume they think by the time that generation rolls through, they'll be long but gone. But this is a really good political chip to play. And it's going to save money, which is going to get them reelected within their sort of allotted terms in office. All right, let's just start with some back to basics. All right, I've divided it up into a few different categories so we can talk about what this actually means, back to basics. And most people say stupid things like, we should get back to reading, writing, and arithmetic. And let me be very clear. That inherently is code as an anti-race, anti-LGBTQ plus curriculum, anti-inclusivity curriculum, anti-diversity curriculum, anti-woke curriculum. This word that it means amazing, inclusive, intelligent things, and the right has somehow shaped it so they're all little minions, think that they're following some sort of grand gesture of attacking the woke, and that actually makes sense. It actually makes you less intelligent. It's making you more ignorant. It's making you less educated and less capable. And the people that are following this mentality, I feel bad for. Some days I look at them and go, dude, wow, you've really been sold a line of garbage, haven't you? And you're just going to run with it because that pundit is making you feel good about you. And you have no forethought whatsoever. So let's go through some of the things. Math. Let's talk about math for a second. This is a touchy subject, right? Everybody, well, first of all, most people hate math anyways, but you know what people really hate? New math. And, and I'm not even going to pretend understand the intricacies of the new math and the way that they teach it. I'm going to give you kind of a methodology so you can understand this. Because a big issue is the fact that people who are parents of students in schools today, they don't understand the new math. So when the kid comes home with new math, because they're not funding schools enough in order to have teachers there, in order to have extra help there, in order to actually do it properly, they're coming home with new math and their parents are looking at it and going, this is garbage, because they don't understand it. So what do they want to do? They want to completely negate its value before even understanding it. Now, I get the impulse, guys. Nobody wants to look stupid in front of their kids. I don't teach math. They can't come to me and talk about new math. You know what I don't do? I don't say it's garbage because I don't get it, right? I don't say it's useless because I haven't taken the time or I don't have necessarily the capacity, which could be probable, to understand why it has value. Let me try to explain it in a way. When we were kids, again, 48, we were taught, or I was taught math, and kids that were good at math, not great at math. Kids who were great at math understood math. People who were horrible at math just dropped out, never to be seen of again. And then there was us that sat between, let's say, the 60 to 85%, like that math mark grade, right? And what we were taught is very simple. You memorize. You memorize your times tables, you memorize equations, you memorize certain types of problem sets in order to correctly apply the right formula in the right order. That's what my generation did, for the most part. That's what teachers taught us. You memorize timetables. Now, there is an inherent value in memorizing times tables. I get it. But rather than saying memorize times tables, what new math is trying to do is trying to get you to understand the theory and the spatial intelligence behind that memorization, right? If you can make somebody understand something, they don't need to memorize it because they get its foundational realities. And I know you guys all have seen clips of this because everybody's watched TikTok, who has gone on YouTube, who has done whatever, has seen like 15-second videos where individuals solve math equations in like 13 different ways. And we're all like, why are you doing that? It takes longer. I'll tell you why they're doing it. Because it shows a different relationship between numbers and between sequential orders and through problem sets that all of us don't get. We just don't understand because we were taught to memorize. Now, here's the problem. Getting kids to understand math, getting kids to understand sort of conceptually and spatially and theoretically, that's a much bigger mountain to climb. And I'm going to say something else. I don't know how much of the teaching force right now is built to teach it well. I don't know. I know some great math teachers who do a beautiful job. I know some math teachers who are like, no, it's garbage. I'm going to teach the way I've always taught. Listen, I think when we make these big shifts, we have to assume there's going to be lag time. We have to assume that new strategies, that new theories, that new ways of understanding and teaching have relevance. Let's assume that they all get in the right hand, have relevance, but it's going to take a minute. for teachers and for parents and for everybody to catch up. And it feels like it's taken a lifetime. I'm going to argue because, especially places in the United States, but also Ontario, we haven't invested enough money in re-educating, in redesigning, in hiring teachers and re-educating teachers that have been in the profession a long time in order to do that job well. The ideas of new math are amazing. It is, to us, complex, right? But to little kids who are doing little trees of mathematical origins, I mean, to them, it makes perfect sense. And kids at younger ages can learn more things. But if we want that program to work, we need to invest more money. And rather than invest more money, rather than allow our kids to get better at math, rather than allow them to understand it, rather than hire, I'm going to go you one step further, math teachers specifically in elementary school, where that is their speciality, where that is the only thing they live, breathe, and practice is mathematics. We don't do that. We have the same teacher teaching you teach history, you teach English, then you do a little bit of math, you send them away for music, whatever. That's where we start, but that's going to cost more money. So guess what governments want to do? They want to negate it altogether. What a bunch of garbage. Kids should sit down, be quiet, memorize those times tables, memorize their formulas, memorize the periodic table. Right? What a crockish. Why do we ever have to memorize the periodic table? What a waste of brain capacity. We should have spent all of that time understanding it. Because I know that we did the one day where they're like, these are the metals, these are the gases. Look, I think that has value. That has value, understanding it, how it's structured, why it's structured, where elements come. Guys, there it is. How are we not spending tons more time on that? And you can explain that conceptually to very young kids. We're waiting to chemistry to do that. Why? Why not explain ideas of that in grade 5? I'm telling you, they're smart enough. I'll stand by it right now. They are smart enough. Want to know why? Nobody wants to completely overhaul the education system. Nobody wants to admit we got to be doing it better in this age, in this time, in this context, right? We need to start looking at different ways of getting back to math. We don't want back to basics is like the most, and not even to mention that there's new mathematical formula, that there's new conceptual analysis, that there's new theories, that there's all new stuff. Math always has new stuff. That's the point of math. Get smarter. Science. Back to basics. Science has never been more true than it is today, and tomorrow it'll be more true than it is now. Everybody gets that, right? Because science isn't about, and I know, please, you're going to go off on some tangent about pharmaceutical science. Look, I'm not talking about business. I am talking about science. Okay, I'm not talking about the application of science, and the reason why that gets skewed is because of money. So that's a capitalism problem. That's not a science problem. Scientists are interested in finding out patterns, in hypothesizing, who plan experiments, continuing the experiment, replicating the experiment to see what the end result is to get closer to the truth. That's what science is. Back to basics? You want to go back to less truth? Less scientific model? You want to go back to when we didn't have discoveries, i.e. Pluto wasn't a planet? What back to basics do we want to go to? Again, I point to the only thing they want to go back to basics about is making the curriculum dumbed down, is making it more streamlined and specific in order to make sure our students are being successful. But let me be very clear. We're not giving them better tools. We're not giving them better strategies. We're not giving them better teaching techniques. We're lowering the bar. Right? So when we ask them to learn less, their marks get higher, and our governments and our agencies can pop their collar and say, see? Who thinks this is a good idea? And again, I go back to parents. Look, our kids should be smarter than us. If our kids aren't smarter than us, we haven't done our job, period. If our kids don't question new things, if our kids aren't critical, if our kids don't want change, we have dropped the ball and society will come to a grinding, pathetic halt. We want innovation. We want critical analysis. We want change. We just don't want to pay for it. And when I say we, I do mean the government and citizens, because we're electing the governments who make these asinine promises and then in their whole spiel say, and I'm going to lower your taxes, right? Because by the way, these same governments disempower teachers, call them glorified babysitters, tell the world that they don't need the education they got, and they're subtly, they're trying to transform your child and socialize them completely again. No. Make no mistake. Education is about opening perspective, not narrowing view. And the only people that don't want an open perspective are the people at home who want the narrow view. So when we talk about those individuals, we are not talking about teachers on the whole. Could there be bad teachers? Of course there could be. Of course there could be. But the bad teachers are the ones standing in front of the classrooms telling their kids not to challenge them, not to look in different textbooks, not to critically analyze their information or perspective, not to correct them when they make a mistake. Those are the teachers. Right there. History. Guys, listen, what I don't understand, I'm a history teacher, okay? So since I was in school, there has been what? 30 years of history. So we just keep tacking that on the back end. So today, my students need to know 30 more years of history to be considered educated in that field. What back to basics are we doing? What on earth do you think we should be doing? Because I have a feeling the back to basic history people want us to go back to memorizing key dates, memorizing names, battle statistics, all of that kind of trope in order to, sit down and say when the War of 1812 ended. Why? Why? I'll tell you why. Number one, it's easy. Number two, it's very seemingly objective. Here's a list of dates. Please memorize those dates. If you memorize those dates, you get the 90 and you can go off and call yourself a historian. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The way we used to talk about history, and again, I've been teaching for 20 years in history, okay? The stuff that was excluded 20 years ago, that was still history of the era, i.e. in Ontario, in Canada, the history of the Indigenous population, the history of residential schools, the history of our cultural genocide, all of that, right? All of those pieces wiped out. They weren't in the history books. Teachers didn't teach them. They weren't even a part of sort of an overall cultural awareness, except for in the Indigenous communities. Why is that? Well, I'll tell you why. Because we had an illusion, a pretense of objectivity back then. We didn't have the internet. And I know it's hard to imagine a world without the internet. So if you're, under 40, please roll with me for a second. But we didn't have the internet. So if we didn't have the internet, the textbook your teacher gave you and the 50,000 books in the library, that was it. Now, that seems as though it's more significant truth, doesn't it? Well, if it made it in a book, obviously a bunch of people said it was okay to make, they verified it, they justified it, and they put it in a book. So it makes it more true. Number one, absolute garbage. We know very, very clearly, and everybody admits it openly with their chest puffed. They just say it's the best way to study history, that victors write history books. So in that case, it's always from their perspective. So we've only ever learned, and we all recognize this isn't debate, we've only ever learned what the victors have to say. That's it. Well, that's not history. That's a sliver of history. And you want to talk about censorship? Major publishing houses and curriculum creators are the foundations of censorship realities that are so incredibly imbued, that are so incredibly ingrained in our society. We actually think they're objective truths. People talk about censorship on social media platforms. Guys, the amount of voices today, right now, we have more access to information and opinions than we've ever had in the history of the world. Of the world. You might not like them, and some of them might get kicked off for hateful speech and all of those kinds of things, but we have a broader breadth of actual opinion that the world gets to see and engage in. Think about it. Before, you had to what? Own a paper? You think Hertz and Pulitzer cared about adequately surveying the population? You think they cared about selling papers? News agencies. If you wanted to get on a news agency and say what you thought, they had to deem you credible. An organization of such narrow scope and such narrow population had to deem your views credible. Now you can build any social media account, and if you resonate with people, you'll get popular, right? Now, could they take it away? Sure. So is that a possibility? Absolutely. But still, right now, there is less censorship than there's ever been. And I'm going to go you one step further because here's the really scary part about history before now. The exclusion of all of the minority perspectives, African Americans, immigrant populations, the LGBTQ community. We have a whole host of individuals, women, that were completely and utterly wiped out of history. Completely. Do we want to go back then? I think the people that say back to basics want to. Honest to God, what do you think Ron DeSantis is trying to do by saying ridiculous things about slavery and skill set acquirement? He's trying to go, we know the last people that said that? Well, they were around about, I don't know, the 1700s, who said it's good for them. That's the back to basics he's talking about. He wants to eradicate all of the voices and all of the minorities who have now gained the capacity, the right, the voice to speak on themselves, their history, and their identities. He wants all that eradicated because that doesn't count, because somehow that's not an objective truth. Meanwhile, he's relying on the fact that people just don't want to learn it because it makes them uncomfortable. And therefore, when he says garbage like back to basics, it gives the illusion of some semblance of objectivity. When the scariest thing history has ever done, by far, is pretended as though, is given us the pretense. When you study Canadian history, out of your 400-page textbook, you have all the information, all the relevant information. So you go about your life with your chest puffed, rhyming off when, I don't know, John A. Macdonald was prime minister, and you think you know something. You think you have it on lock because in grade 10, your government said that was all the vital information you needed to know, and we want to go back to that? What? The only reason anybody wants to go back to less information, to less education, is to control the population and spend less doing it. It's absolute garbage. They like the power structure that existed then. They want those stories to be dominant. They want that literature to be seen as the only objective literature because everybody else who has spoken since has countered that literature, has countered that objective pretense of reality. My God, they want to go back to a time where women were property. Slaves, obviously, property. Kids were nobody had voices except for who? White, Christian, straight, rich men. That's the only objective truth. Just saying that out loud should make everybody lose their mind. English. Back to basics. These are the same people that fight about things like Ebonics, right? And different dialects of the language emerging. Why do you think we don't speak like they do in England? You soft celery. By the way, I call a lot of people potatoes. And there was this big argument on my Twitter page about calling people don't insult the potato, but calling them a piece of soft celery is actually a much greater insult because it has inherently no value and no enjoyment whatsoever. So there we go. Soft celery. That's what I'm doing. Because the English language, just like everything else, is in a constant state of flux, transformation, evolution. Every language does. I listened to a TikTok over a 3-minute period, and they showed how the English language became the English language. That's how it happens. New words get admitted. New forms of grammar get introduced. Different sort of vernacular and cliche and tropes get. That's what happens. And we're trying to put the brakes on all over the place. Why? Because the power structure that used to be able to dominate and create it no longer gets to be that dominant. That's why they hate Ebonics so much. That's why they hate it. That's why they want to destroy it. Now, do we only want to read Shakespeare forever, guys? Like, I don't dislike Shakespeare. I think it's amazing. I think archetypally you see the foundations of a lot of major stories. I think it's a great thing to learn. I question all the time whether he did it, because I think that's a funny conversation and that could be studied. What a brilliant way to sort of attack the common ideas of the day and who got to control information and who got to take credit for information and different forms of literature and what that said about the time. And there's this whole conversation about how many men actually wrote Shakespeare. I like the theory that it was his sister, literally and metaphorically. The fact that women had no right to write. So what did they do? Well, they wrote under pen names as men. Do I think we figured some of them out now? Sure. Do I think we figured them all out? No. And how many brilliant writers did we exclude altogether? The Bronte sisters broke through. What if there was somebody better than the Bronte sisters? Took away their pen, smacked him in the head with the book. Study Shakespeare, but let's not pretend as though he is, even if it was just him, the be-all and end-all of all literature ever created. Do we really think that in the last 500 years we couldn't do better? Or have we created an idea that we can't do better? Have we created this ridiculous notion that what was done then is the best? Why would what was done then be the best? We knew less. We knew less about other cultures. We knew less about other people. We understood less about humanity. We understood less about math and science. We understood less about architecture. We understood less about psychology and sociology and anthropology. Why on God's green earth do we think he had it on lock? Asinine. Absolutely asinine. The only reason is giving again, constructing an illusion that old white British dude had it on lock. There is the pinnacle of intelligence. There is the pinnacle of literary access. There is the pinnacle of the person that we should be studying and ingraining and transforming. And I'm just saying, I like him. Great. But maybe, just maybe, 500 years have seen other literary geniuses that we should be starting to take into some sort of serious account. It's absolutely asinine. It's absolutely asinine that we think in that day and age we had it on lock and today we don't. Why? Why? Back to basics. And here's the big problem. I think the back to basics is trying to do, and again, I'm going to go right to the beginning of this entire podcast. It's trying to get us to do it cheaper and quicker. That's the goal. That's the goal of educational institutions, especially those funded by the government, cheaper and quicker. More kids in a classroom. How do we jam 30, 40 kids in a classroom like we used to do in the good old days? Please note the sarcasm in my voice. How do we jam that many kids in the classroom? How do we make sure they get good marks? How do we make sure that they pass? How do we give the pretense, the illusion that they're actually doing better than they were? Because we all know marks, by the way, grades are a complete and utter subjective reality. Anybody that tells you different is full of crap. Of course it's subjective. Of course it is. It isn't if you simplify education, right? Because if you simplify education, but I'm going to tell you why that's a problem. If you simplify education, if I tell my history students, you got to name, I'm going to give you 50, historical figures, 50 dates, 50 events, and you have to explain them all in 5-mark questions. And there's clear answers that I've given you. And if you hit all the points, cool, you get the marks. That's it. And then I have a ranking of my students. A couple problems with that. Number one, I've simplified education. I've made them less intelligent because nowhere along the way did I start questioning, critiquing. Did they start looking at other perspectives? Did they look at the why of history, not just the what? Because the what doesn't matter without the why. Memorizing the what, the date, the person, the blah, 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 absolutely has no relevance whatsoever. You might as well just burn those history books as they're doing down, south of the border in some states. And then I'm going to say this. Even if that was all the information, let's pretend I had some ability to get at the most vital pieces of historical data. And I sat my kids down and I drilled it into their head, and then I made them recount it and regurgitate it on a test with pen in hand. Now, what am I losing? Because I'm still trying to gauge which kid gets it the most. But then we have this entire other body of information which says not every individual can sit down and memorize and write down and comprehend in that same way. Because if you made them write it down, they might get 50%. If you let them say it, they get 100. So what am I trying to test there? Am I trying to test their intelligence? Am I trying to test their capacity to hold information? And if I'm trying to test that, then the methodology of me getting that information, how I'm going to get it out of the student shouldn't matter, but it does. Right? And why does it matter? Well, why does it matter is quite simple, right? Why does it matter is glaringly simple about how we simplify and streamline that process to make it give the illusion of objectivity. When in actuality, I'm not really just testing history. I'm testing kids who are really good at the structure I've given them to test history. And some of you might say, well, who cares? The kids back in our day, you know what? The kids back in our day dropped out. The kids back in our day went and did something else. Meanwhile, could you possibly imagine, just like all these other geniuses that drop out of school altogether, if we would have shifted the way in which, the structure in which we applied this information to our students, we would have kept those geniuses? Maybe just a handful? We would have kept students who had a completely different perspective on how to look at things, rather than, just like I did, sit down, be quiet, memorize, regurgitate, move on. That is not education. I repeat, if we are not questioning, criticizing, applying, that is not education, that is memorization. It is a waste. And that is what back to the basics means. But man, was it easy to apply. A standardized test over here, an IQ test over here, an aptitude test. You didn't get grade 9 math, so we put you in another math, or we let you drop math because obviously you're just not good at it. What an easy, functionally pathetic, but an easy, cheap way to apply education. What an easy, cheap way to give the illusion that education is happening. And that was for a time, guys, where the jobs were completely different. Because I haven't even talked about the most important part, back to basics, in this era of computers. Everybody who's my age, who you're 48 and up, you took grade 9 typing in Ontario anyway. That was it. I remember vague notions of like, you should take some binary in this computer class where it was like green computer screens and it looked awful and I didn't want anything to do with it and I just avoided it like the plague. Of course I did. I had my first email in university. Nobody did research on the internet when I was in university. We went to the library. And now we want kids to go back to basics when for the past 20 years, they have access to more information than ever in human history on their phone. What? We want to go back to basics in the most complicated, digital, overwhelming world that we have ever seen before? Back to basics? Are you crazy? Everything just got, 20 years ago, things got exponentially harder. Because with this onslaught, this wave of information, you can study journal articles in India. You can read, scientific models from parts of China. You can read excerpts from, text in Uganda. Like, this is what we can do today, right? This is our access point. And we're saying back to basics? No, no, no. We're just avoiding the reality. Not only that, now more than ever, you remember when we were kids and you needed primary sources in order for them to be considered legitimate. First of all, we could start questioning that. Second of all, now we need to teach kids the hardest skill of all. We need to at least talk about it. We need to dive into it. There should be courses on it. How can you tell the difference between legitimate and fake pieces of information on the internet? You want to see a hard class? There it is. There it is. Back in the day, you'd at least have to get a publisher to buy into your bull crap. And there were a lot of publishers who bought into lies, i.e., lots of people like to deny what went on in 1939, and there were stacks of books helping them prove that, which was absolutely asinine. But today, you get on your podcast, you get on your news channel, you get on any form of social media, and you can start to spew whatever you want to spew with very little, if no evidence. And even better, now we can have manufactured audio, manufactured video. AI is getting so freaking real. How do we know who said what, when they said it, or if they really did because they've had this other generated idea? Guys, we're in a brave new world. And rather than shy away from it, get back to basics. Serious governments, real governments, governments interested in education and empowering their electorate and their students, that curriculum should be vastly expanded. There should be huge, huge chunks of money going into research about how to teach this, how to debate this, how to put this on the map. But instead, what do they want to do? Ignore it? Why do you think that is? Why do you think that anybody would want to do anything less for our kids? And again, I'll go to you 2 reasons. To spend less money and to control and manipulate less intelligent individuals. That's it. That's it. So the only people who support this idea of back to basics are individuals who want to control and limit new information, individuals who want to roll back the days of oppression and marginalization to serve the class that is already in power, individuals who wish to give the illusion of education and success to bolster their careers while limiting those in progress. Number two, for individuals who greatly want to cut educational budgets under the auspice that they did it better in 1957. And finally, individuals who don't understand or refuse to understand the complexities of teaching new and progressive ideas, ideologies, information, perspectives, and educational strategies because their tiny little soft celery brains cannot comprehend what the future brings. And on that note, let me know what you think in the bio. Let me know your comments, your questions, your anger, points of refrain. Put it all in there, and I will answer them all in another podcast. But until then, I will see you next week. Same bat channel, same bat. No, you know what, guys? Not always do I end so clearly and articulately. Same bat time, same bat channel. Dismissed.